Everyone, and welcome to the module 10 video. This is the first of two videos. Funny story, kind of, I suppose. I was planning on getting this, usually this will be up on Tuesday. When I went in yesterday to sort of find your questions, I noticed that, oh, wow, we haven't completed not everybody's submitted the questions. And then I noticed, oh, the deadline hasn't approached yet. What I've done in the modules part, which you've probably noticed, is I switched the order of the questions, and so the one I clicked on was actually the one that's due for yesterday or today. Anyway, so that's why they weren't complete. But I'll put off this video till today, but usually it'll be up on Tuesday. Is the upshot of it. Well, I picked a few good questions here, and so I'm going to discuss them now. The first one is this: if terrorists are supposed to provide credible information to audiences who they are trying to influence, and why are they always trying to kill and destroy those audiences? So is fear a form of influence? I think you're sort of answering the question with that last part there. One of the things, but I love the question. I love the way it's formulated, and it allows me to really get to the fundaments of this article, which is quite a long reading for us. In this book, it takes up a few pages more than some of the other readings we've done. But at the beginning, it sets up terrorism as a problem of communication. And so when I've taught this in the past, students have asked, well, if it's just something as simple as communicating with one another, can't we, isn't this a very easy thing to resolve? And the answer is no, right? Because the communication that has to get done. So terrorists, groups who employ terrorist strategies are usually quite weak. I think we'll see this in another reading that we do. So terrorists are quite weak, and so yeah, of course, like what they want to say to the government is, oftentimes it's to the government, maybe it's to a different audience, but perhaps would-be supporters. But one of the things they want to say, one of the things they want to say is, hey, we want autonomy in this region, right? Say Basque separatists, for example, or Irish nationalists. So they're going to say, give us Northern Ireland, give us the Basque territory, and give us self-government. And they're going to, so they say that, and then they say, listen, if you don't, we are very determined to make this happen, and so if you don't do it, we will attack you. Right? The problem is the government shouldn't really just take their word for it, right? Yes, they might sound very resolved. Yes, they might make impassioned speeches. But of course, that's what separatists should do, right? They shouldn't be like, hey, look, we kind of like it if you would give us the Basque area for our own homeland, but we understand if you don't really want to. That's not going to work. Nobody's ever going to think to do that. That would be ridiculous. So of course, everybody, every separatist, every group with a particular political aim, which might be territorial, which might be policy oriented, which might be, it might be, hey, this group of people is special. We need our own schools, right? Now our own laws that govern our community that are different from the other people's laws. All those things might be goals of terrorists, and they might be goals of groups, right? That will then turn to use terrorist tactics. But the reason that they have to turn to terrorist tactics is that they're weak. So they're not going to get their own way through the ballot box. They're a minority, right? They're too small in the countries that they have to influence to really affect things that way. Otherwise, that's the path that they might have taken. They're too weak to affect it through sort of normal political means, and so they have to turn to other means. But the other thing, the main thing I'm talking about here in terms of communication is that they have to be able to communicate how much they want something, and to what lengths they're prepared to go. And they can't just say it. They can't just say, "Oh, we'll bomb you. We'll flatten your capital cities. We'll murder innocent civilians. We'll murder soldiers. We'll murder agents of the state until you give us what we want." So even at this point, right? At this point, the enemy of the terrorist in that situation, usually, like I said, the government, maybe they're listening to that, but they still can't really take, because if that's all it takes, if it just takes me going on a video, making a video of myself breathing out threats, even very serious threats, if that's all it takes for me to get my own way, then this is a very easy business, right? Politics will become much more simple. Become much more chaotic, right? In that we'd have to be giving everything to everybody that just makes a video, which is fairly cheap. Talk is cheap. Anybody can do that. So there has to be some other way to communicate our intentions. And so terrorism is a way to communicate our intentions, particularly attrition. I think they talk about in the first place. Attrition is one way to show your resolve, to show, look, we're really going to go out there, we're really going to kill. Now, because we're weak, we might not be able to really go to war with the state. Maybe we would like to go to war with the state. Right? We'd like to take on the armed forces. We'd like to take on the state, but actually we're quite weak, and we wouldn't last very long doing that. And so, what's the next target down the list, right? And so terrorist groups, because they have to sort of find a softer and softer and softer target. Of course, the softest of targets is people going about their daily business in marketplaces, in train stations, just in the streets, right? Because they're not usually trained or equipped or ready to deal with any sort of a violent attack in a way that an army base might well be ready to repel some sort of armed attack or other strong government targets. So, credible information to audiences. We want to tell you what we want you to believe. What we tell you, we can't just say it. We can't just make the video. We have to make some sort of a signal, that's costly to us. Right? Because if it's costly to us and if it's costly to you, that's when we get taken seriously. Right? We're putting our money where our mouths are. We're going to go through with this, and the strategy of attrition in particular communicates that. It communicates that, look, we're willing to die, we're willing to fight, we're willing to kill, we're willing to cause an inordinate amount of damage, an unacceptable amount of damage, until we get what we want. Because again, just saying it, talk is cheap, and we shouldn't give just to anybody that threatens. And of course, in the book, like we find that terrorism, the first sentence in what we read, terrorism often works. Extremist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and the Tamil Tigers engage in terrorism because it frequently delivers the desired response. For my own background, my own sort of familiarity is certainly with the IRA in Northern Ireland. What happened in the 90s, right? The British government negotiated with the IRA, and the IRA got a lot of what they wanted, right? Even if it's not straight away. Even if the province of Northern Ireland hasn't been completely absorbed into the Republic of Ireland at this point, the British government did concede that, okay, one day we will recognise when the people of Northern Ireland vote along those lines, when the demographics, as they continue to change and as they continue to favour Catholic nationalists, at some point there will be a referendum, and we will accept the result of that referendum and give it back to Ireland. That's in writing as part of the Good Friday Agreement. They got a power-sharing executive, right, where Irish Republicans have to be, of course, it hasn't been functioning for the past little while, but they got a Northern Ireland Assembly where the nationalists and the unionists, right, the parties that have usually been more popular parties, and that's starting to change. That the unionist parties can only govern there with the support of the nationalists, the Irish nationalists, the Republicans, right? So it works. Right? Ultimately, right, governments, of course, don't want it to seem like it works. Right? They don't want to, because they don't want to encourage it. But oftentimes, particularly in these sort of in the context of attrition, there are things that the states the governments won't want to fight that hard for, right? There'll be issues and maybe parts of even territories that are not worth the blood and the treasure that it would require to fight an armed resistance, and so they give it up. And they talk about Britain in, I think, Cyprus, I think, is one of the examples. Here we go. During the last years of the British Empire, the Greeks in Cyprus, Jews in Palestine, and Arabs in Aden used a war of attrition strategy against their colonizer. And Britain decided, look, Cyprus, Palestine, and Aden is not. Well, it was worth it up to a point, right? They fought up to a point, but at some juncture, they decided that the cost is no longer enough. Right? These people are resolved. They've communicated how far they're willing to go, how far they're willing to fight, and how much costs they're willing to put on us. And those costs we find unacceptable, and so we'll talk about giving up that territory. So that's that credible information to audiences. Sure, they're killing them in order to communicate this, but obviously there's always enough people left to negotiate with afterwards. Second question: can someone still be called a terrorist if all their actions are purely political? I think that's the only way that they can be called a terrorist. If we agree with Kidd and Walter here, their definition of terrorism is the use of violence against civilians. We'll come back to that later. There's another good question about that. Very good question. Use of violence against civilians by non-state actors to attain political goals. Right? Now, actions. Maybe this is the thing. So I suppose if the question is implying that they're not using violence against civilians, then okay, that I say no. If what we mean by actions are purely political, that they're engaged in a political process, either through perhaps, certainly through parliamentary or through, electoral politics. You wouldn't say that like a political party who are purely only engaged in electoral politics or a terrorist organization, right? If they're not using any violence against civilians, you wouldn't say, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or in any other country, any sort of normally founded political parties who are only engaged in the electoral process are terrorists. You usually wouldn't say that. You probably shouldn't. It'd be a very difficult case to make, I think. There are some political parties, right? So I'm thinking now of the first party that came to mind was Golden Dawn in Greece, who are engaged in electoral politics. They run for elections, they get elected to parliament in Greece, that sort of thing. But they also have been implicated and accused of being involved in violence outside. I guess I've been a little bit too generous to them. I'm remembering now a clip from Greece where he's an MP for Golden Dawn and he punches another MP in the face on the TV, right? That's obviously extra political violence against another civilian, right? Another member of the parliament. But there's also been, that's bad enough, right? But there's also suspicions and assertions and criminal trials, right, that have linked sort of members of the party to murder of political rivals and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying that it's not possible for a political party to also be a sort of linked with terrorism or perhaps be terrorists themselves, but it's possible. But it's certainly possible if that's the implication of the question. Right? If they're only involved in electoral politics, there's also groups who are involved in non-electoral politics, of course, right? Outside extra parliamentary politics, where they might be organising peaceful protests, demonstrations. They might be going on the TV and advocating for their point of view. They might be writing literature, engaging in sort of civil disobedience, maybe that sort of thing. But if they're not perpetrating violence against civilians, which they also could be, right? But if they're not doing that, then I think then it would be difficult to call them terrorists too. The other party I was thinking of course, Sinn Féin, who forever, right, have been the sort of the political wing of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. They say that Gerry Adams, right, who led that for a long time, Martin McGuinness, who was also important, said no, we're not members of the IRA, but they were very clearly closely related to one another. So it's possible that the people who are engaged in parliamentary politics are also engaged in terrorism. That's absolutely happens, um, but you know, uh, obviously not all political parties are doing that. And I think the other way to interpret this question is then to talk about, uh, is to wonder about, okay, can they still be called a terrorist if their actions are purely political? And I think if they're using violence for political ends, that's what terrorism is, uh, as opposed to. And I think this is a good discussion that I often have when I teach this class and when we read this reading and when we talk about this definition. One of the things that sometimes comes up are the Mexican drug cartels, right? Now, I don't know a great deal about Mexican drug cartels. I always try and resist the urge, even though now when I read this, I think of them constantly, and some of the strategies that are in here, particularly the intimidation, I think is certainly used by these cartels, these groups. I guess I know enough about them to know that they use intimidation tactics, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But my position on them, as much as for whatever it's worth, is that they're not terrorists because their goals are not really political. They sort of have to get engaged in politics in some way, but ultimately their goals are, again, as far as I understand, to supply illicit narcotics to a market and to make money. Right, their goals are economic goals, right, to get rich. And the sort of the political activities that they get involved in terms of sort of bribing local officials, right? They're not really for them to gain political power, right? But it's more to enable their economic operations to be ongoing and to go on sort of at a lower cost, as low a cost as possible. So that's the other implication I think of this question is like, can they still be called a terrorist if their actions are purely political? I would say if their goals, rather than their actions, I suppose, if their goals are not political, then I think it's difficult to call them a terrorist, or more difficult. I think you have to have more justification to call them a terrorist if they have no political goals, right? When we talk about political goals, it says here that the ultimate goals of terrorists have varied over time. 5 have had enduring importance, right? So I think these are great to be getting on with, right? So in terms of political goals, they should look something like this: regime change. We want to change the current government. That makes me think of the Red Army faction in Germany, right? Some of those very left-wing terrorist groups in the 80s, where they wanted to install some sort of socialist or communist government. Like they were revolutionary communists that wanted to change the political regime. Right? They want to install some sort of communist government. So regime change might be one. Territorial change, which often makes me think of separatist movements, or like the IRA perhaps, or the Basque separatists. We're still in Europe now. Of course, Europe's not the only source of terrorism, but it certainly has existed there for a long time. Policy change, right? So we want, again, special recognition of our group. We want different. We want our language taught in schools, perhaps, right? We want that's, I think, social control. Makes me think a little bit of ISIS now, moving away probably from Europe, and Hamas. We want to be the ones who are looking after our people, right? We want to be the ones who are making the laws and the rules in this city or in this region, and we want to be the ultimate authority here. And status quo maintenance. That's an interesting one that I can't think of a particular example where we say we are terrorists. We're going to use our terrorist activities to maintain our current situation. But there you go. Those are the 5 that the Kid and Walter think. But those are the political goals of terrorists. And so I think if they don't have those political goals, then I think they're not terrorists, right? There's something else, maybe organized crime. And I think for me it is useful to separate organized crime from terrorism, political terrorism. And all terrorism, I'm saying all terrorism is political. So hopefully that's a beginning of that answer there. Target, okay, so this one, the next couple of questions I think really get into some of the tactics and the strategies. I should use the term strategies. That's the term that they prefer in the book, in the reading. Let's have a look at this first question now. It says, the book defines terrorism as the use of violence against civilians by non-state actors to attain political goals. We've said that. We didn't make much of the non-state actor part of things. Sometimes in the class I often have students as well who want to say, maybe the state is a terrorist, actions that maybe the British have taken in the past or the Americans in other countries, or even perhaps sometimes in their own country, has amounted to some sort of terrorism, it's violence against civilians for political ends. I also like to maintain the distinction between like states that, for me have an air of legitimacy, especially democratic states, but I don't know, they have some sort of states have some sort of sovereignty. We can define sovereignty as like a monopoly of the use of violence. And so, yeah, the state is going to use violence against even against civilians sometimes. Even if we think of things like police, they're going to use violence against civilians in order to keep order and that sort of thing. That to me does seem like a very different operation to like terrorist operations. But I can certainly entertain the other argument. I prefer to for sort of just being able to be specific about what we're talking about. I prefer to split those two things up. Non-state actors to attain political goals, thus limiting the scope of terrorist activity to that which targets civilians. My question, this is a very good one. My question is whether or not acts of violence against military personnel by non-state actors, like the 1983 bombing of the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut or the bombing of the USS Cole, are not acts of terrorism. Right? What about non-state actor attacks on political personnel, like the bombings of American embassies in Tanzania, Kenya, and Lebanon, or the plane that flew into the Pentagon on 9/11? I've always considered such acts to be terrorism, and that certainly makes a lot of sense to me, as I think most people would. Yep, I think I'll include myself in there. So I'm curious as to why they're not. One thing I think the low-hanging fruit in this question for me is you say, okay, like the bombings of American embassies in Tanzania, Kenya, and Lebanon. For that one, I'm going to say those guys are civilians, right? Their government. And not everybody that works in an embassy is a civilian, right? There are some Marines, right, that usually are sent as sort of security for the embassies, and there'll be other military officers and things that work in general. I had a friend who worked in the U.S. Embassy in London. He was a U.S. naval officer, and he was in charge of deciding how and when and which military technology to share with Britain, right? I'm sure a lot of military technology gets shared between Britain and the US, and he was there actually very responsible for coordinating that and for coordinating that. So he obviously is not a civilian, right? He's a military officer. Similarly, I had a friend in the Greek embassy, the US embassy in Greece, who was a Marine. He was the commanding officer for the Marines who were attached to the embassy to provide security for what could be sort of very serious situations. So there are military personnel at embassies, but I think the majority of people working in embassies are civilians, right? So that's sort of the low-hanging fruit I see in this question, right? If you're attacking embassies, sure, they're government officers, but they are civilians. I want to say the same with the Pentagon. Obviously, there'll be military people working in the Pentagon, but in as far as we have civilian officers of the government that are working there, right? Civilian people working there, that's also an attack on civilians. The civilian, and this is, I suppose, I'm just giving this myself, but I'd say, for me, the distinction between civilians and non-civilians are, you're a civilian if you're not in the military. Right? If you're not serving in the military, you're a civilian. Right? Even if you're working for the government, you're still a civilian. Policemen are civilians. So yeah, lots of civil servants are civilians, and then there's that sort of small group of civil servants that are not. Well, it's not that, depending on the country, I suppose, it's not that small. But there's a group of civil servants who are not civilians, who are military personnel, who And this is, and now we're getting into the more challenging part of the question, right? Because there is definitely a challenging part to it. Certainly, if we talk about the USS Cole, that's a military ship packed with military personnel. I suppose one of the sort of one of the experiences in my life, I suppose that sort of gave me my sense of this distinction between military and civilian was I had a friend when we were 16. One of my good friends joined the Royal Navy in the UK, and he came home from training one weekend, and we were out down the town, and we were walking, and he was saying to me, we were talking about his training, and one of the things he said to me was, I think he might have said to me something like, "Oh, you've got to be careful walking with me now." And I said, "Why is that?" And he says, "Well, they taught us that since I'm now a member of the Royal Navy, now I'm a member of the Armed Forces, that I am a legitimate target for terrorists now." Which complicates this question even more, which complicates this sort of the theme of this question more, because he is now not a civilian, right? He's now a military person, a member of the Armed Forces, but they taught him that by being a member of the Armed Forces that he's now a legitimate target for terrorists, which then if we're saying that terrorists are using violence against civilians, right, then he's not a civilian, then I don't quite, then that causes some, I guess, some complication or some contradiction, or at least some tension there. So certainly I'm with you. I think it's a good question. If non-state actors, if terrorists, non-state actors groups are bombing the Marine Corps barracks, as they did, if they're bombing the USS Cole, they are attacking. They're attacking military targets, quite hard targets as well, probably, right? Much harder than your average civilians walking around a town centre or a marketplace or something. Me and my friend were in the shopping centre in Hartlepool, but we would have been soft targets, right? But the USS Cole was not a soft target, right? Neither's comparatively, right? And neither's the Marine Corps barracks, right? And neither's an embassy. And I've noticed around the world that the United States is hardening its targets. In Athens, for example, I say I had that friend who was the commander of the Marines there. We were over there in Athens. This is about 20 years ago now, so I'm not giving any secrets away. I don't think he would have told me if it was a secret. But we were involved in a training session. He wanted some volunteers, and me and my group all went along to volunteer, and basically we were playing the part of protesters, right, who were getting sort of on the embassy the embassy grounds. We started off on the outside, and we started to sort of attack the embassy, right? And the Marines were supposed to defend the embassy. And one of the things that they had at that time, and probably still do, I imagine, is they had gas canisters around the embassy that from a control room inside the embassy they could activate and sort of give a knockout gas. I don't know what sort of gas it was. Give some gas out of the embassy. A big cloud of gas comes out and sort of knocks us all unconscious. Which is what they did. They didn't really activate the gas, but they simulated doing it. And so then we all had to go and lie down in the central courtyard, because I guess that was the next step, was to sort of take you in to this courtyard and have you there and sort of watch you. And so some of us, then it wasn't me. I wanted the role, but it went on to a couple of my friends. They put on these big body suits, full pads and everything all over them, big thick pads. And they were told, okay, now in the simulation, you're coming round, right? You're regaining consciousness, and you're going to attack the Marines. Attack the Marines, which was I kind of with the whole bodysuit on it, would be kind of fun. But actually, so there was a couple of us that got that job. I think there were 4, right? Because I think 2 of them had weapons in their hands, and 2 of them didn't. Like weapons, it was just sticks, but like sort of padded sticks, So as they came to, they had to struggle a little bit with the Marines. And I remember one guy, also from England, really going at them, but getting really hammered also by them, by the butts of their rifles. And actually, I think in the end, the Marines shot them all. They shot the resistors, which they were supposed to shoot the ones with the weapons, but not shoot the ones without weapons. So anyway, they shot them all in the end. But I guess that was a story from my life, which I don't know. Thanks for listening. But the idea is like these targets are quite hard targets, right? The gas, the Marines defending them. These embassies are not soft targets like marketplaces would be, where you would kill a lot of civilians. So yeah, I accept that, and I think that is a strong point that we make. That look, terrorists might attack hard targets too, and I suppose it's, and we'll read something in a minute next time, I think, where we'll discuss the difference between terrorists, guerrilla forces, and conventional forces. And so we'll talk more about this there, and we'll sort of talk about them as being on a continuum where the very weakest actors will use terrorism, the very strongest actors will be the conventional forces, and then sort of in between that, on that continuum, we have these sort of guerrilla forces who are halfway between terrorists and conventional forces. But the stronger you get, the probably the more likely you are to take on these sort of harder targets. Good question. On page 128, and I have the book in front of me, so I can go there. It says that terrorists are in competition with governments for the support of people. But earlier in this section, it says that terrorists attack people weaker than the government they are against, which would usually be the people, right? So I'm seeing the civilian theme again, right? Terrorists are going to attack civilians, but terrorists want the support of the civilians, right? So I see the tension that you're bringing out there. So how can the people be the terrorist's main target, but also be attempting to gain favor with them? So I want to answer this in two ways, sort of a quick, easy way, and then so I can take more the spirit of the question, which I think is a good one. One way is depending on, it can sort of deal with the definition of target here, right? So if we think of them as target of violence, then that gets more complicated, and we'll discuss that in a second. But if we think about them as a target in this way, a target of persuasion, I'm looking at page 126 at the very top, and you see that that picture, that diagram there, and at the top it has target of persuasion, enemy, which I'm saying is oftentimes a nation state, the government is oftentimes the enemy, and the other target of persuasion might be their own population. So if we're saying how can the people be the terrorist's main target, but also be attempting to gain favor with them in this definition of target of persuasion, that's exactly what that means, right? It's exactly what it means, that the people and their own population are a target of persuasion, and we're trying to gain favor with them, right? So those two things are not contradictory if we just see it in that way, right? Which is one of the ways that they want to use it there in the book, right? So we should definitely be aware of it. The other target of persuasion is the enemy, and so you'll see on this diagram here at the top of page 126, we've got power, right? If we want to, if we're a group that has political goals and we want to tell people we're powerful, again, we could go on the TV and say, "Hey, everybody, we're super powerful." But that's what we would say, right? Because we want our own way, so we would say that we're powerful. So we have to try and convince them of that and that. And so if we're trying to convince a government, let's say the US government, if we're trying to convince the US government that we're powerful, we might take the strategy of attrition, right? Where we try to make it costly not to listen to us. We're going to go out, we're going to cause violence, right? Cause damage, serious damage. Now they say in the book, remember, right, they say that they attack terrorists, they attack civilians. But imagine if we were strong enough and we were attacking hard state targets. Imagine if we were attacking the military, and imagine if we were getting away with that, right? That shows that the harder the target we can get away with hitting, the more powerful that we are communicating that we are. And so, much more effective than just telling people. Resolve similarly, right? Hang on a second. Let's stick with power a second. Power, because this is really where I think the question is going that we're trying to answer now. If we want to show our own population, people that might support us, I don't know, what are we now? Arizona separatists or something like that, right? say we're Arizona separatists. Please know that I'm not really trying to to cause any kind of ferment here. I think that's something that you would take for granted. But I guess I sort of came of age at a time when we were very suspicious about all sorts of terrorist activity. I'm certainly not in favor of any of that. But let's say we did want to convince, let's say some people in Arizona might support that, right? But they might look at us and they say, who are those guys? They're not powerful enough but I'm not going to get involved with them because what can they do for me? It's only going to get me in trouble with the government, and the government's very strong, and I don't, although I might sympathize with their cause, I don't want to get in trouble, right? But what if we could intimidate them into it? We would show our power to them, right? If we could force them, and if we could say, look, we'll punish people who don't support us, we'll punish them, and we'll get away with punishing them. Now their decision making starts to change. Now they start to think, well, I am for their cause. I didn't want to get involved before because I thought they were just a bunch of idiots, right? A bunch of weaklings who couldn't really do anything. But now I see that actually, like they're punishing people who are not supporting them, right? And so now those people, our potential supporters, are our targets, but it doesn't mean that we're hurting them in particular. Yet we'll hurt them in a second. But right now we're hurting people who disagree with us. So now that the calculus is starting to change, and they're starting to say, well, they seem to be able to get away with quite a lot of things. Maybe I could support them. Now imagine if we went and demanded that support. If we went and demanded from them obedience, maybe supplies, right? We went around and started collecting money from them and other, guns, weapons, or whatever it is we would need. Now, and so let's say they're a little bit reluctant. But let's say we force them. We use our force to make them do it. Now, I suppose the few people that were forcing to do it, maybe we're even killing some of them who were initially refusing. Now the other people around are saying, okay, hang on a second. Not only the calculus is now completely different. Not only are they able to evade any kind of response from the government, evade any kind of punishment from the government, they might be able to protect me from doing it. But on top of that, if I don't, they're going to maybe kill me, right? So why not join them? I already agree with their cause, and I also don't want to die, and I see that the government isn't coming to stop them from doing whatever they're doing, and so I better comply because I'm more afraid of what they'll do to me than I am about what the government will do to me now, right? So that's the idea behind intimidation. The target of persuasion is my own population. I want to show them how powerful I am, how powerful our group is, what we can do, what we can get away with, and what we can do to them if they don't support us. That's going to persuade them. That's intimidation. So again, we're trying to communicate our resolve. We're trying to communicate our power either to the enemy, is one target, to the government, or to the people who might be our supporters. Right? Okay. And you can see similarly, we want to communicate our resolve, right? Our ability and our desire to make this happen. And we do that to the enemy through attrition again. And to our own population, we do it through our bidding by showing that we want it more than maybe there's a rival group of Arizona separatists as well, right? Who maybe they're not as resolved. We might talk about that a little bit later, a bit more. But that's the reason that it says that terrorists are in competition with governments for the support of their people. One of the things to get the support of the people is to show that you're more powerful than the government, right? At least in this particular area. Right? Maybe we're not more powerful than the United States on the whole. If we were to fight a pitched battle with them, of course, we wouldn't win. But maybe in this particular part of Arizona, right? Maybe in a remote part of Arizona, and the United States is difficult because the state is very strong in the United States, and also, well, that's it, I think, because the state is very strong. Even in maybe areas that are quite remote, the state can be quite strong. We saw some of that with that rancher in Nevada recently, perhaps. Right? We saw that the United States, if we think of how powerful the United States is, like it wasn't able or willing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, to exert its full power on that situation. But we'll see how, it's one thing to do it in the middle of it'd be one thing to try and operate like that in Washington, D.C., perhaps, and it's another way to do it on a ranch out in rural Nevada, perhaps. So, all right. I hope that answers the question. I think it answers a few more questions as well, perhaps, that we haven't really asked, but there we go, a bit long-winded. We've got a few more questions here. Right? When discussing Al-Qaeda's ambitions when performing the terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center, Andrew Kidd and Barbara Walter explain how one of the reasons they may have done it was to help radicalize the Muslim population. Can you explain what this meant exactly on greater detail? I don't know if my detail will be that much greater, but I'll give it a go. Have a look at provocation. So this is the bottom right of the diagram on top of page 126, provocation. We're trying to say something to our own population. And so again, there might be some people in the world who are not radical. There might be some Muslims who are not radical. Of course, there are lots of Muslims who are not radical. Radical Islamists, let's say. There are some that might be on the fence. So there are some that might be actually not at all radical Islamists. There might be either Islamists or there might be even non-Islamists going about their daily business, and they look and they see Al-Qaeda and they see Al-Qaeda's mission and they say, that's not me. That's nothing to do with me. That's not about me. I'm not interested in Al-Qaeda at all. Al-Qaeda are my enemies. Al-Qaeda are killing me and my family. They're as much of a threat to me and my family as they are to anybody else in the world. So I'm certainly not on their side. Okay. So now, one of the tactics to try and target those people and get those people on side is this: it's provocation. What we want to do is, although the target of persuasion is our own population, the sort of the target of the strategy, if you like, where we're going to put out is on the government, right? The opposing government, the enemy government. So if we're talking about the World Trade Center attacks, the hope there, right, is if we attack America, if we attack the United States in its homeland, and if we do something, then the United States is going to respond. Right? We're provoking them into a response. And when they respond, they're going to come to, I don't know, maybe Saudi Arabia. Of course, we know that they don't come to Saudi Arabia, right? They go to Afghanistan, they go to Iraq, but they don't, of course, go to Saudi Arabia for good reason. But we'll talk about that maybe in a second. Because Al-Qaeda has a lot of significance for Saudi Arabia. So yeah, the idea is they'll respond, and when they respond, those guys that we talked about at the beginning, those non-radical Islamists, right, maybe just normal Islamists, or maybe people who are not even Islamists, they'll see the United States attacking Muslims in Muslim holy centers, like Mecca and Medina, of course, but we don't go there, which was smart. Because of course that's how Al-Qaeda gets started, right? It's one of their major problems, or the major sort of motivations for them was, hey, we have American soldiers in Saudi Arabia. We have these infidel soldiers in the home, the most sacred places for Muslims. We have these infidel soldiers. This is embarrassing. This is an insult to Islam. This is an insult to our civilization. It's an insult to all of us. So imagine the provocation. Imagine if we can get them to come to bring more and to start killing us here. They start killing us here in these holy areas. Even those people who are maybe moderate Islamists or maybe not Islamists at all, once they see that, they're going to flock to our cause. They're going to flock to our cause, especially, and so we know that they don't go to Saudi Arabia. We know the Americans go to Iraq and to Afghanistan. Think about Abu Ghraib. Think about Abu Ghraib prison, the abuses that went on there of prisoners. That's exactly what Al-Qaeda wants, right? That's exactly probably what ISIS wants as well. And they want to hold that up and say, look, this is how the Americans feel about us. This is what they feel about Islam and Muslims. This is how they treat us. Look at it. Look at that, and don't be you talk about moderation, right? Now I'm being, I guess, an Al-Qaeda leader talking to like a moderate Islamist or somebody who's not an Islamist. Look at you talk about you talk about us being a threat to you. Look what the Americans are doing to us. This is our people. right? And then the idea is that we could radicalize, you know, convince more Muslims in those places that the Americans are brutal infidels who are bent on abusing and humiliating and killing us in our holy land. That's the tactic, which is why there's got to be some sort of caution in responding to this sort of attacks, because of course you're being provoked into it for the use of the terrorists. Now, in the book, I found this one of the probably most interesting sort of parts, this provocation, because provocation works well when your enemy is kind of in the middle of this spectrum. So the spectrum is this: you might have some governments that will commit genocide, right? That will just say, right, we're going to wipe everybody out. I think those are few and far between these days, but they have existed in the past, where we say, right, you attack us like that, we're going to kill everybody in that group. And of course, if you've got a powerful, strong government that's willing to commit genocide, provocation is probably not what you want to do, right? You're going to lose. The other side of it is if you've got a government, the other end of the other extreme of it is that you've got governments and states that are so committed to human rights and so committed to not committing violence on anybody for any reason. So pacifistic, very dovish governments on the very extreme, where they, you could do what you want to them and they're not going to respond. They're not going to respond in that way at all. So your provocation fails in that way, not because you've all been killed in a genocide, but because they just won't respond. You won't provoke them. The sort of conditions that are most favorable to provocation is where the government's halfway in between, where they will respond with some brutality, but they won't wipe you out and all your people with it, right? They have some level of threat. So it's kind of an interesting one, where the response to it shouldn't be in the middle. It shouldn't be moderate. It shouldn't be moderate brutality, right? It should either be total and absolute brutality that wipes everybody out, which of course it probably shouldn't be that for other reasons. Genocide is just not good, obviously. But then the other side is, the other way that doesn't work is if they just won't be provoked, if they won't come after you, if they won't attack you in your homes. Remember, right, the point is that they will come and attack you in the homes, and that they'll kill some innocent civilians in the process that will radicalize large portions of society. They'll say, look, I thought those Al-Qaeda guys were bad, but look at these Americans coming in and killing civilians, innocent civilians, in drone strikes, and they're flattening apartment complexes, and they're killing our people. Okay, I wasn't an Islamist, but maybe those Islamists have a point. Those radical Islamists have a point. Maybe we have to fight. Maybe we have to take it to them. So that's the idea with provocation. The next one is, what exactly does outbidding mean when it comes to terrorism? It's competition, but over what? This was maybe the most complicated one, I think, in terms of outbidding. And it sort of depends on there being multiple groups who are all vying for the same population. The idea here is that what we're going to do is, again, I'm going to go back to Northern Ireland for a second, because often for like the 80s and the 90s, and probably before, but I was only aware in the 80s and 90s, until the Good Friday Agreement, and still to this day, although the roles have shifted after the Good Friday Agreement, but before the Good Friday Agreement, there was very defined roles. You had two unionist parties, two parties that were, for the Protestants in Northern Ireland that wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. There were two parties. There was the Ulster Unionist Party and the Democratic Unionist Party. The Democratic Unionist Party were connected with all sorts of paramilitary, like terrorist groups on the British side, right? On the Unionist side. Like the Ulster Defence Force and all those guys. That was the DUP. They were connected with that. The Ulster Unionist Party, they were much more moderate, much more respectable, and not connected with the paramilitaries. I don't think, right? And so you had two groups there. You had the moderate group and you had the hardline group. Similarly, on the nationalist side, right, those that wanted to join with Ireland, the Republicans, you had the Sinn Féin, which were connected to the Irish Republican Army. They were a political wing of the IRA. And then you had the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, I think it is. Pretty sure that's right. They're always called the SDLP. And those guys were the moderate nationalists who weren't connected with the violence in particular. And so you got two groups there on each side. And the outbidding is the tactic of being the hardliners, so being the DUP or being the Sinn Féin, of saying we are more hardline than those guys. So again, right, the target of persuasion is your own population, and you're trying to say, if you're Sinn Féin, you're trying to say to the nationalists in Northern Ireland, look, the SDLP, they're all talk, they're not doing anything. You know, they're moderates. Do you really want the moderates talking to the British? You're not going to get as much. We're hardliners. We're not going to compromise on anything. Right? We want a united Ireland at any cost, and we're willing to do anything to get it. Those SDLP, they'll sell you out. They'll sell you out, and the gains that we can get you, they can't get you, because we all know that they're moderates and they're sellouts. Right? They offer you peace, but at what price? Right? You're not going to get what you want. We won't give you. We're not offering you peace. We're offering you war and conflict and strife, but we'll get you what you want. And so it says in the reading how there's a bias towards hardline negotiators. You want an agent, somebody to negotiate for you who is more hardline than you are yourself. And so even if you're a moderate, you say, look, I'm a moderate. I can live together with Protestants. I think that ultimately we should be part of a united Ireland. I'm Irish. I feel Irish. But what's important to me is peace. So you might say, okay, I'm going to go vote for the SDLP, but Sinn Féin come to you and say, yeah, okay, that's what you want. You're a moderate. You want peace. You feel you don't hate the Protestants. You don't want to kill anybody. We get it. But we're still going to be better agents for you, because you'll get what you want and a little bit more than you even want. We'll get you even more. And so that's the idea of outbidding, is to be that hardliner that appeals not only to the hardliners, but also to moderates who realize that being moderate doesn't always get you what you want. You can get more by being hardline. In the 80s and the 90s, the SDLP were definitely more successful in the electoral box than Sinn Féin were. And so were the Ulster Unionist Party, who were much more successful in the electoral politics than the DUP, right, the hardliners. So the moderate parties did better. So that sort of disavows that a little bit. But since the Good Friday Agreement, it's swapped. It's swapped so that the Sinn Féin and the DUP are the most popular parties now from each side, which to me is interesting. I haven't studied it enough to have a full explanation of what's happened, but it seems it's something that happened around that Good Friday Agreement somehow disfavored the moderates. I guess, and I'm sort of making this as I go along, because again, I haven't studied this in full, but it seems to me like it was the hardliners that really, people maybe said, look, the hardliners they've brought us peace, right? They've got us what we want, at least on the nationalist side. And then maybe that works on the unionist side by saying, look, the IRA have gotten everything. You were voting for the Ulster Unionists, for the moderates. Look where that got you. Right? You've given everything up. And so now the DUP becomes more popular. Right? So that's my uninformed explanation about the DUP. But certainly, the 80s and 90s part of it and the outbidding part of it is certainly, I think, valid, right? That you have one moderate group and one. The classic example of that isn't Ireland, but is Palestine, Hamas and Fatah, right? Hamas are always trying to outbid Fatah, saying, look, Fatah have had a long time. They're too moderate. They're too ready to compromise. We're the ones who will really get you what you need. And you see in the Gaza Strip, Hamas are in charge. The West Bank, Fatah are in charge, and they're trying to outbid, I guess, outbid the other one. Hopefully that's a decent explanation. We'll do this last one because I think we've covered quite a lot of ground Within the readings, the ability for states to conduct themselves in a certain manner of brutality might deter would-be terrorists. Would this include having a strong and active military, or is this more of extrajudicial power? We sort of covered this earlier on. I did like the question because it was about to allow me to cover what I think I already covered. For consideration, we have seen the United States, the world's premier military arm on the planet, be one of the key targets of terror attacks. Yeah, I like that for two reasons. One, that last one sort of gives us back to provocation. They could do, the United States could do a lot of damage all over the world. If we can provoke them into it, that's going to be great. It's going to give us a lot of support. Again, as long as they don't wipe us out. And that's been the US tactic, right? Is we want to be careful not to indiscriminately, try and wipe out. What would you do in the Middle East, right? Try and wipe out all Islamists or something like that. That level of brutality, the United States would be a bad tactic. Not just because it goes against human rights and it's kind of evil. Not only because of that, but because that would get a lot of people against the United States. And the United States really isn't a country that's going to engage in genocide of a whole people. That's just not what the United States would do. Oh, I'm thinking of counter arguments to that now. But I don't think that these days the United States would do something like that. Anyway, but the other extreme, right, of not being provoked at all and just refusing to be passive, that's also not what the United States would do, right, as a powerful country in the world system. And so what they've tried to do is be selective about who they take out. Right? And so they use the drone strikes as the tactic, right? Drone strikes, let's take out the leadership, take out a lot of the leadership, that might defeat them. And being very careful not to blow up civilians. And of course that's happened, right? That we've missed the target. But every time we do that, we run a strong risk and perhaps of playing into the terrorist hands and garnering them more support, which obviously makes more work for ourselves in the long run. So that might be it. I think I'm sort of coming to the end. I've gone on almost an hour now. This is way more than I would talk in class, I think. Well, hopefully it's been helpful. It's answered some of the questions, and certainly I enjoyed this reading. I think it's an interesting one that's sort of based in strong research, and also terrorism is something that's really happening in the world, and it's really a big issue that is a popular issue to think about and to talk about. So hopefully that was useful and enjoyable to you, and hopefully you're not put off by the length of the video. All right, it's going to take me a while to upload it, but it should be up in the next couple of hours. Of course, if you're watching it at this point, it's already up. But yeah, all the best, and I'll do another one of these. I think I might leave this for this week, since I've covered quite a lot, and it's been an hour. So maybe that's enough content for this week, enough discussion for this week. So watch out, maybe more for next week.